There's always that, the mute. The demonic mute.
Yeah.
It's always when you say the best thing, too.
Yeah, always.
Well, I think he can hear us because he was gesturing, so whether or not he wants to say anything is another question.
No, but we'll call on you first.
Yeah, right. Thank you.
That's what people are always afraid of, right?
I'm watching it.
Come up and testify.
Cannot unmute. Yeah, he can't unmute.
Thank you.
Got it.
How's your sign language, Whit?
Oh, well, all right. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for being here. Bishop, thank you for agreeing kind of the last minute. It was a Monday night conversation. I thought, maybe we should do this. And he said yes. It was really quick. So thank you. It's challenging time. And so I'm going to let him kick it off. I'll fill in around my edges. He's got obviously a lot more experience than I do in a lot of this stuff. I've never been there. So I have, my experience is arm's length. But anyway, so you tell me what slides you want.
Okay, let's just put up that first one about the geography. You've all seen this. We've all become probably experts in the geography of the Middle East, if we weren't before in the last week. But I always think it's so interesting. We think of Israel, of course, always as an incredibly powerful military force, and it is, and particularly backed by us, but even in their own right, they're a powerful and formidable military force. We can talk about later about why the colossal failure took place of intelligence this time, but at any rate, it's historically been a very powerful military force. And, they're kind of paranoid, Israelis. But the old saw is just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. And if you look at the geography, you can see why. It's a relatively small country, surrounded by Lebanon in the north, which we know is maybe not the enemy itself, but Hezbollah. Its radical forces certainly are. You've got Syria, contested Golan Heights in the middle there. Syria has attacked Israel before, 50 years ago in the Yom Kippur War. Jordan are the good guys. There's a treaty with Jordan. They've always been absolutely a voice of reason and wonderfulness for many years at least. Then you've got Saudi Arabia down in the southeast, Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. You've got Palestinian territories in the Gaza Strip on the west, and on the West Bank, you've got Gaza. You've got Gaza on the west, and the West Bank on the east. So it's confusing. The West Bank is on the west bank of the Jordan. That's why it's called the West Bank, even though it's on the east of Israel. At any rate, they are completely surrounded by either announced enemies who just do not exist, or prior enemies, or ones with which they're in some kind of dialogue about trying to normalize relations. So it's a perilous place to be. I did my sabbatical part of my sabbatical at St. George's College in 1994. St. George's is an Anglican college, mainly for continuing education, for clergy and lay people that conduct tours. It's a wonderful, wonderful ministry. I mean, some of you may have been there or certainly know of it. It's just provided so much context and perspective. And I really wanted to go there. I had, in my youth, I think I'd always said, I don't need to go there and walk in the footsteps of Jesus. After all, the footsteps of Jesus are right here. The risen Christ is in our midst. I don't need to go there. But at this point in my life and history, I did want to pursue that. And have always loved Israel. I've always loved the Jewish roots of our faith, and have really interpreted Jesus as a reformed rabbi in a way, a reform movement within Israel. I see us in many ways as Paul talks about a a branch being grafted onto the roots of Israel, and that's certainly been my perspective always. So I went to St. George's and did 2 courses. One was called The Palestine of Jesus, where we simply explored the normal sort of holy sites, I suppose, and maybe even we would think tourist sites, but we went a little deeper. We had lectures by rabbis and scholars and Jews and Muslims and Christian Palestinians, and we visited not just as tourists but as pilgrims to these places. We prayed there, sort of like we do at the altars of the world here. We prayed at those sites. So the first one was Palestine of Jesus, and then the second course I took was called a desert course, and we took 3 jeeps with an Egyptian doctor who was our guide down into the Sinai desert and traced some of the pilgrim routes that early Christians and others over the centuries have taken to the holy places, Mount Sinai being the primary one, or at least the mountain range where Mount Sinai is supposed to have been. So it was a powerful, powerful experience for me. It was transformative in so many different ways, as it often is for those who go there. People who take this pilgrimage usually say, I'll never read the Bible the same way again, and it's certainly true. I had always, I suppose, or for a long time, known that there were Christians in the Middle East, especially Orthodox Christians. The Orthodox Church churches have a big presence there. They've been there forever and have custody of many of the holy sites. And so I'd known about Orthodox Christians, and I knew we had an Anglican presence there. The Roman Catholic Church was there. There were some evangelicals there. But I guess it had never really dawned on me that these Christians were Palestinians. When I heard the word Palestinians, I always thought of probably terrorists first, certainly Muslims second, and not necessarily simply those who live in the region. And so when I began to hear Christians of Palestinian origin talk about the situation there, it just provided a different perspective. So what I just wanted to share briefly, and we're going to have plenty of time for discussion, I don't want this to be a lecture, is that the reason this thing is so intractable, getting upstream of the awful invasion, and clearly no one is going to justify Hamas's terror attack on Israel and civilians and all the rest of it. But to try to separate out, first of all, Hamas from the Palestinians in a larger context who live in Gaza and elsewhere. Secondly, to separate out Christians from others in that region. Christians are a very small presence. I don't have all the numbers, but we're tiny and getting smaller all the time.
We listened to not at the same time, he sent me the link to an address by the Archbishop, the Anglican Archbishop of Jerusalem. And he said, I think, if I remember, he said there were only 1,000 Christians in Gaza.
That's right. In Gaza, there are thousands.
2 million people, of which only 1,000 are Christian. But there are Christians in other, Palestinian Christians in other places, but at least in terms of Gaza, the number of Christians is not very large.
Right. Palestinian Christians are everywhere. In Jerusalem, they're in the Palestinian places like Nablus, and they're everywhere, but small in numbers and diminishing. Christians are leaving by the droves because their kids, I think about Iowa, the kids grow up in Iowa in a small rural town and there's no future for them, so they leave, they go to the big cities. Well, that's happening big time in Israel and Palestine. Christians who have options, and many of them do, they're middle class or above, most of them, many of them, they get the heck out. So we're a diminishing presence, and the leadership there prays always that people would stay and that the Christian presence would be there so that one day we don't wake up and there are no Christians in the Holy Land. But at any rate, the reason this is so intractable and to get upstream of the invasion is because there are just 2 narratives that people live by that are incompatible. You cannot put them together. And I just shows a couple of examples of those. This slide 1 is a traditional Israeli narrative, and it's the one that most of us grew up with and probably still embrace in many ways. The legitimacy, they say, of the Zionist enterprise, in other words, the return of Jews to Jerusalem and the Middle East, of returning Jews to Eretz Yisrael, that means the land of Israel, is based on Jewish descent from the ancient Israelites. The Jewish people have inherited their right to the land religiously, legally, and historically. Jews have always looked and prayed toward Zion, Jerusalem. They've never relinquished their relationship to the land and have always maintained a presence since ancient times. Despite expulsions, Jews were treated as foreigners and persecuted wherever they were during their long exile. And obviously that is both the rationale and the celebration in 1948 when the Jews from scattered all over had a homeland once again and returned home, and the world in many ways, much of the world rejoiced at that. So that's certainly how they see it. It's trying to separate, in a sense, trying to separate the Jewish faith from the land is very, very difficult. But in an alternate narrative, the Palestinian narrative, this is the story. Judaism is a religion of revelation like Christianity. It has no inherent right or tie to a particular land. Jews are not a nation, but rather a community of believers. In any case, any Israelite presence, short period in the history of Palestine. Ultimately, religious beliefs without presence in the land or possession of the land are incapable of creating ownership right. Palestinians are, in fact, descendants of all previous inhabitants, including Canaanites, Jebusites, and all others mentioned in the Bible. So, when you read you go all the way back to Numbers and the earliest parts when Joshua led the troops in and they displaced the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Jebusites and all the rest, Palestinians say that was us. So all those years ago, 1200 BCE, Palestinians were there, and then we were expelled by the Jewish presence. Later, the Jews were expelled, we returned, and there's been a kind of continuous presence of Palestinian descendants of these early tribes for a long, long time. Two more narrative parallels, and then we'll stop for a minute and see about your responses to that and questions to that. So this early narrative, it was really about the Bible times, about the fact that Jews were, that the Israelite people took over the land, conquered the land in Bible times. Well, in 1948, of course, they were, after World War II, there was a restoration and a return. We all saw the movie Exodus, right, in the old days. And remember that Paul Newman was the great hero who led the Jews back to Israel. Well, the Israeli narrative about 1948 is the Palestinians weren't expelled, they fled. In most cases because they were ordered or cajoled by their Arab leaders and the Arab states. In many cases, Jewish officials pleaded for the refugees to stay. The Israeli decision to prevent refugees from returning, in other words, those who were expelled in 1948, there's always been a hope that those refugees would be able to return at some point to a Palestinian state or somehow be welcomed back. The Israeli decision to prevent refugees from returning was justified. Otherwise, Israel would be destroyed by a hostile Arab internal majority. Ultimately, the responsibility and blame rests with the Arab leadership for rejecting the partition resolution. There was the United Nations resolution after World War II, which did divide the land. And, in hindsight, one would think, well, they should have jumped on that. Both sides should have jumped on that. It might have saved a lot of bloodshed. If you look at, I don't have a map of that, but basically the Israeli territory was in the middle. Jerusalem was an international city. It was not a capital of anything. And the Arab state was really all around it. Well, I guess that would have scared the returning Jews to some degree, and the Arabs wanted all of it. They said, this is our land. You just kicked us out. Why should we agree to a partition? Yasser Arafat did the same thing in the 80s, I think. He rejected a partition which wasn't great, but compared to what we've been dealing with for the last decades and decades, it might have been the way to go. Hindsight is 20/20, and we don't stand in their shoes. or sit in their place. So I make no judgments. I'm just saying there have been options for petition and a kind of two-state solution, but it's long past being helped. So that's the Israeli narrative, that the Palestinians left and that they were restored by world demand, by the United Nations and the victors of World War II saying this is now a place for Jewish homeland. Number 4, this is the Palestinian narrative of that event in 1948. Beginning soon after the adoption of the partition resolution in November of 1947, the Zionists began to expel Palestinians from their homes, according to a plan. Deir Yassin, on April 9, 1948, was a planned massacre that succeeded in stampeding the Palestinians to leave. Women, children, babies were slaughtered in that massacre on April 19, 1948 by Jews. The Nakba, or catastrophe, was planned and carried out as ethnic cleansing. The Zionists recognized that a Jewish state could not exist until most Arabs were expelled, and history proves this was the plan that was carried out. And so what Jews and many Christians and much of the world celebrates and celebrated in 1948 of a creation of a Jewish homeland, so that for once there was a place where Jews could be safe, or once there's a place they could really call their home and be recognized by the international community and in some sense protected. It's seen by them, it is seen by Palestinians, many Palestinians, as the Nakba, the catastrophe. And they were driven from their homes yet again in violence. And then once that happened, many of them did indeed flee and left. So that there was a very small minority left, but still there were Palestinians always there. There still are. So that was kind of the perspective that I think I heard maybe for the first time in my life, and what I heard it from were not Muslim extremists, were not terrorist groups. They were Christian Palestinians. They were Orthodox Christians, Roman Catholic bishops, our Anglican bishops' presence there. I think it's clear that Palestinian Christians are for a two-state solution, almost up and down the line. Very few, if any of them, believe in some kind of violent revolution. A, because it wouldn't work. They don't think it would be successful. B, because many of them are pacifists. They do indeed engage, some of them, in nonviolent protest against what they call the occupation, and they want a two-state solution. But we have invariably been on the side of dialogue and seeking a two-state solution and peace. I know of no Christian Palestinian there who supports Hamas or Hezbollah. Hamas itself has changed, and I'm stopped, I swear, after this. Hamas itself has changed. It was always a militant group, always left the option open for armed resistance. But when I was there, I went with presiding Bishop Catherine Jefferts Shore in 1994. No, it was later than that. I was already on the staff, sometime after 2000. We went through the checkpoint at Gaza, trying to carry a generator for the Arab Ali Hospital, which is in Gaza. It's an amazing place, only 60 beds. They take care of everybody, Jews, Muslims, terrorists. If you're dying, they will take you in and heal you, try to. So we were trying to take a generator so that when the lights went out, they'd have something. Well, we got to the checkpoint, and the people on the Israeli soldiers has confiscated the generator and wouldn't let us take it because they said, if you take it, they'll dismantle it and turn it into rockets and shoot back at us. I won't say that wouldn't happen. I don't know that, but I do know that taking a generator to a hospital was probably a good thing and might have saved lives. At any rate, they took it from us. We were a small group. It wasn't just Catherine and me, a small group. We were then taken by car to the Arab Ali Hospital and other places in Gaza. And we had a Hamas bodyguard. We had Hamas people in Jeeps with AK-47s because they didn't want anything bad to happen to a couple of Christians wandering around there under their watch. I don't know that they were so concerned about our safety, but they didn't want an incident or a scene of any kind, and so they escorted us there. Hamas at that point was militant, but they also provided social services, police department, food for the sick and needy. So they had a kind of social service arm. Then they became a kind of force, and they were indeed elected as the leaders currently in Gaza. So they are a government in a sense. And I think it was frustration. They were only elected by about 51% or something of the vote. So about 50% of the Palestinians in Gaza didn't want them. 2% did. And so they got them. And since that time, whether it's influenced by Iran, which I think is likely, or whether it's just increasing frustration with the fact that nothing ever seems to get better, 2 million people are continually jammed into this city that's meant for a third of that. They have done this terrible, terrible thing. They've become increasingly militant, and they may have even learned from ISIS. Certainly their tactics look more like ISIS than it does like anything else. So it's an awful, awful situation. I have a couple of things to share later, but I'd like to stop and get conversation unless you want to jump in first and then the conversation. Yeah.
A little bit. So I belong, as many of you know, to a number of interfaith organizations, and we had a meeting scheduled for Thursday anyway, but the conversation turned obviously to this, and it was led by a rabbi. For those of you who heard my sermon or who will hear my sermon, not the same rabbi, as I mentioned, but he mentioned the issue about these parallel narratives, and argued that it's necessary for us to know both of them, so that we can help it, so that it can help us understand what's going on. But he said it's impossible right now to write a dual narrative, to write another one that's dual, because who's going to do the writing?
Mm-hmm.
And so after he was done, one of the other sort of main speakers is a Muslim. He's Turkish, so he doesn't have any of the main ties to Palestine, or certainly not to the Palestinians or to Gaza. But he raised the question again with the question of these dual narratives: is how far back do you have to go to get to a single narrative from which these two diverged? And he said, is it Saturday, a week ago Saturday, when that all started? Does it go back to 1940? Does it go back to 2006 when Hamas was elected? Is that where the parallel? No. Does it go back to 1947? No. Does it go back to 325 when Christianity was legitimized and that changed the nature of what was going on in Palestine? Where do you go to get the single narrative that these two diverged? And I thought, that's pretty powerful. So that's one comment. The second thing that he pointed out, Ismail, he said that Gaza, I don't know if you know how big Gaza is, but just for a point of reference, it's as big as the city of San Francisco in terms of square miles. 2 million people. There are only 800,000 in San Francisco, and if you've been there, you know it's crowded.
It's crowded.
2.5 times that. And if you paid attention to what's been going on in the last couple of days, the northern half is being pushed south. So now you got 2 million people in half the size of San Francisco. And they're all of Gaza is technically dependent upon Israel for power, for water, for all of these kinds of things. And so when you remember the defense minister saying, no more this, no more this, no more this, no more this, there's nothing there. They don't have any resources. And the only place in and out is this poor little checkpoint now that's down on the border of Israel. So it is, there are 200,000 right now, probably more since Saturday. 200,000 of those 2 million, 10% are displaced. They don't have a home. It's gone. So he wasn't, the discussion that we had it was all heartrending. There wasn't anybody who was sort of championing one thing or another. Everybody was decrying, as Chris did, what Hamas had done. But I was privileged. I originally didn't want to go to this meeting. And then when we decided that we were going to do this, okay, I'll go. Now I've got a reason to go and to pay attention. But I was really glad that I did, because I learned a lot. And, so anyway, I'll stop there and see if there are questions.
You want to get to a single timeline, a single narrative. In 1600 BCE, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, forefathers of the Jewish people, bearers of the faith of one faith in Israel, one faith in God, settled in the land of Israel. The tribes of Israel go down to Egypt because of the severe famine in the land of Israel. So those are all familiar narratives to us, right? If you look at the Palestinian history, 3500 BC, nomads in the region initiate agriculture during the early Bronze Age. 2000 BCE, cities develop and trade expands in the region during the Middle Bronze Age. Palestine becomes an important trade hub. So you have to go back to there to get some kind of a single narrative, and nobody's going to buy that. And of course, history gets muddled as you go through all the changes. Whether Palestinians can trace a bloodline to the Hittites and the Canaanites, they certainly mentally, their narrative traces their history there. Let's stop and let you all talk to us. You've got plenty to say. Yeah.
I have a question, and I haven't been watching the news a lot because it's too depressing. But I'm wondering, because it's a port city, I haven't heard of like refugees leaving by boat going somewhere.
Supplies coming in.
Well, no, I'm sure they won't be able to do that, because I'm sure they put a Navy blockade in there, but have you heard of any of that?
No, it is blocked. I mean, they've got the whole thing sealed, and have long before this happened. It's been sealed.
Yeah.
They can't leave.
By boat.
The hope, of course, is that there might be some refugee pipeline, some escape route that Egypt might provide, which they could do tomorrow and allow some relief. The problem is Egypt doesn't want 10,000 refugees who they probably can't vet properly from leaving Gaza and getting into Egypt. They could be Hamas for all they know. I mean, they could do some vetting, but it would be difficult. We think we got a problem on our border. Like how many people you let in and what the danger might be. Well, look at this.
Well, plus
but it's sealed. They can go nowhere.
Yeah.
I think I know the answer to this, but what's the tight connection between the United States and Israel? I mean, I think I understand because of Iran and so forth, but that makes the Palestinians even hate U.S.
Absolutely, it really does, or at least be disappointed in the U.S. It goes back to World War II and trying to establish democracy all over the world, and Israel was going to be the poster boy or girl democracy in the Middle East, and United Nations supported that, and we did. What could be a bad thing about having a new democracy in the Middle East? Well, the bad thing is they're surrounded by all these enemies, so we better make sure they're strong enough to defend themselves, or they'll be gone. There won't be a democracy in the Middle East. And so we start pouring armaments in there and having their back forever, as the president said, we'll rock solid support. And, I support that. I don't want Israel to cease to exist. What I want is a two-state solution where both people have homeland. They both have a legitimate claim to the land. But these narratives are so intractable. They're so entrenched that finding common ground has proven difficult, not impossible.
I apologize. I wanted to get up and see if there was anything coming in on the chat, which I can't see from this computer. There wasn't, but I just wanted to jump in. And so I don't know if you said that three.
Let me fix it. I might be able to.
Well, no, that's fine. There wasn't anything there. But I don't know if I heard that three-letter word while I was running off. Did you use that three-letter word that begins with an O and ends with an L?
Oil. There is that.
And where does that fit in?
But isn't it also, a lot of fundamentalists they believe in Zionism until that takes fact that won't be a return of the Messiah.
That's right.
Yep.
So that's a big driver too. So-
I mean, that's a fairly brand new and problematic wrinkle in this whole thing. It's not that there haven't been some Christians, marginal kind of Christians, who thought that Israel is going to be the site of Armageddon, Israel is going to be the site of Jesus' return, he's going to stand on the Temple Mount, and, you know. But now there's a huge contingent of evangelical and Pentecostal Christians who have bought that fairly fundamentalist line, which is, you know, you have to really strain at some of the biblical narratives in Revelation or whatever to come up with that scenario, but they strain well. And so they have this picture all in their mind, and they get preached every Sunday that this is what's going to happen. You've got to protect Israel because the battle's going to be there. We have to support Israel because they're going to be fighting the army of the Antichrist. Jesus is going to come with his flaming sword, and we're going to all be sorted out. Some of us have already been raptured by that time, of course, and taken back to the, you know, heaven, but the rest of us are going to fight the big battle of Armageddon, and Israel is the location for that. You know, if you hear that every Sunday from good-looking guys like this preaching from the pulpit,
With slides.
you just might believe it, especially if you're raised that way. So, and those people have a huge influence in our country today. I will leave it at that.
I really appreciate the history. It's great context. I'm wondering, though, what the end game is. So, to me, it seems like the best case for Israel is that they move into Gaza and they occupy Gaza. But then that's like the U.S. and Fallujah. So there's going to be years and years of insurgency. Best case for the Palestinians is that Israel out-crazies the Palestinians sneak attack and does the move into Gaza, which totally does away with any sort of peace talks with Saudi
Right.
Arabia. Neither of which is really a win.
And maybe creates a backlash with the wider Arab world, you know, coming in defense. No, there is not. I listen to I belong to a group called J Street, which is a Washington lobby group. It's called, they call themselves the Pro-Israel, Pro-Peace Lobby. You could characterize them as kind of liberal Jews or progressive Jews who want a two-state solution, who know that Israel has made mistakes in the way it has governed this whole region, but they're Jews and they love Israel and they don't want to see it cease to exist. I listened to a webinar right after all this happened, and it was an interview with two people, Dr. Yoni Shimshoni, who is a retired IDF commander, who happens to have a PhD from Princeton in world affairs, brilliant guy, and a woman named Celine Taboul, who's CEO of something called the Economic Cooperative Federation. They work for a two-state solution. She's a young woman, brilliant, both of them. And both of them said, the long game is what Israel is not looking at. What is the solution finally? Are you going to occupy Gaza? You can't govern it. It's impossible. You would have that insurgency. And so the end game is very, very difficult to see. Celine ultimately said the end game is to do what Israel has to do right now to, strike back, try to stabilize things, and then for everybody in the world to work at strengthening the Palestinian Authority, the PA. That's Mahmoud Abbas's group. They are very weak. He's old, makes Biden look like a teenager. He's fairly ineffective, but he's the successor to Yasser Arafat, the PLO, and he has always been for nonviolence. He's always been, he speaks strongly against Israeli occupation, but he's never been for war. But also nothing's happened in the 25 years under his leadership, and so Palestinians are getting frustrated. I think that's why they elected Hamas. They said, we've got to do something. We've got to strengthen our hand somehow, because this weak-kneed Hamas is not getting, Abbas. I'm getting all these Arab names mixed. He's not doing anything for us. So you're right. Ultimately, the long end game is a two-state solution with the world, somehow mediating. That means these narratives have somehow got to be moderated and some kind of common ground has got to be found. But we're a long ways from that. And this violence only hardens the the two sides' positions, that they're not going to be open to any kind of peace talks anytime soon. I guess the best we can hope for is that Israel follows the rules of war and does what it can to lessen civilian casualties. I realize that there's no place for these million people to go. Jews were trying to be good and say, okay, get out before we bomb your cities, go to the south. I think I would probably have done that. I think I'd have probably packed up my family, my SUV and driven to the southern border to starve to death maybe, or catch diseases or whatever might happen down there. But I don't want to stand under bombs falling on my apartment either. So, there's no place to go.
Is there going to be a lot of bad press for Israel in the next week to 2 weeks?
There will.
Yeah, they've lost the moral high ground, really. They've already bombed apartment complexes. And, so they've already lost that. And that's what bothers me, is that the U.S. has a 100% staunch support of Israel. We begin to look like fools too, because we have no consideration for the Palestinians who are being bombed and losing their lives and who have lost their homes.
Yeah.
So I'm disturbed by the U.S.'s just staunch, blind support for Israel.
I am glad that Biden talked to both Netanyahu and Mahmoud Abbas yesterday on the phone, so he at least has reached out to the Palestinians. But yeah, it's our long historic commitment to, Jimmy Carter, bless his heart, did what he could to try to balance the United States' position a little bit and to recognize some of the Palestinians' rights. And he did, preside over an agreement, but it's too little, and now I'm afraid it's too late.
Gary, I think I unmuted Whit, so he might have something to say.
Yes, thank you. Initially, it said the host would not allow participants to unmute themselves, which is why I was giving you all the hand signals and everything. But anyway, no, Gary, the sound is good now.
Okay.
We appreciate that. Thank you, Elaine.
You are welcome to any input.
Yeah.
That's what
Anybody
we're doing
who's
right now is
online.
input.
Yeah.
Just wanted to let the other participants online know they can also unmute themselves now if they want to chime in.
We had a Palestinian Christian alliance who probably tried to influence our minds a bit. We actually were inside Area A, the West Bank, crossed over 4 times, I guess.
Yeah.
So you got a chance to kind of see things, and then I grew up and said, oh, per capita income is compared to the fenced area and the unfenced area is 10 to 1. And so you see all this youth. It was funny because when I said, listen, I had to get to Bethlehem, and we asked the Tel Aviv, we flew in by ourselves, and we asked the guy at the desk, and he says, that's occupied area. Why would you want to go to Bethlehem? And I said, well, I heard rumor Jesus was born there. He didn't come back. And he looked at us like we were the craziest people in the world that wanted to go there. But we were probably influenced by our guides. They brought in 2 very, very esteemed speakers who were Muslim to preach their case. We never got any counterpart. But what I did observe was the disparity and the youth. And the only thing inside Area A, like in Dublin, they can do is sell us pictures of Jesus and crosses. And that's their life, and they're living on 4,000 or 5,000 a year. And I'm not obviously condoning the violence, but we were going to go, how long will this last? And we have underprivileged areas in the U.S.
Right.
And normally it leads to people joining gangs to get power. And I think the same is happening over there. What these kids have. And there seems to be no sympathy by Israelis at all. And they just want them to go away.
Yep.
And so even over there we were, we didn't go to Hebron, a couple places, because they just had one-on-one kind of violence in the West Bank. But it was an eye-opener.
It really is, yes.
I remember many years ago, John Johansson and Pam go on a trip to the Holy Land. And, I forget if they had Arab guides or not, but I remember, John coming back and sharing that they had a very strong impression that Jews in general treated the Arabs as very second-class citizens and looked down on them very big time.
Yeah. I think we can have some visceral sense of connection when we remember the civil rights days and the, you know, the protests and nonviolence, and then the eruption of Black Power and the violence that took place. Some of us who were engaged in some of that backed off pretty quickly when it started blowing up, you know, ROTC buildings. Well, that was Vietnam, but whatever the violence was. But you understood it in a sense, that finally the frustration of being oppressed for so long and just bubbled over, and young hot-blooded men with explosives began to be too violent. And that's what we're seeing here, I think, in many ways. The sort of, for 50 years, the kind of bottled up oppression that they feel has just erupted once again, and then this time in a horrific way. They're the worst since the Yom Kippur War. There's no question that the others. This webinar that I had was very interesting. Just a few random thoughts. The Israeli commander, retired commander, said, you know, you think about Israel, he said, in the US, we have 6 degrees of separation between us, now 6 degrees. In Israel, it's 2% separation. So everyone knows someone who was either killed or is now hostage, because only 2, you know someone, or you know someone who does. So that's the kind of situation that they're in. He said it's resulted certainly in a lack of confidence in leadership in Israel. They have always thought that they were secure, and Netanyahu was going to protect them, or whoever was in power. There's been a massive shaking of the foundations there. He said the silver lining is that 300,000 of Israelis are now united. You know, it's probably true, because when we're attacked, you know, we have a tendency, like after 9/11, we have a tendency to come together, at least briefly, across all our divisions. Of course, some would argue that our response after 9/11 was not maybe ultimately the best. This military guy said, I don't think of this as a terrorist attack. And now you're hearing this all over the news as a terrorist attack, and I understand that. He said, a terrorist attack for me is one cell of a terror group who does something like 9/11 or a suicide bomber. He said, this is a military attack against civilian population. And so, you know, and in a sense, you know, Gaza, I mean, Hamas is a government. I mean, it's been elected. So he sees it more of a, you know, a terrible thing. Military never, of any country, you're never supposed to have a coordinated attack against civilians. I mean, it's terrorism, of course, but I thought that was an interesting point. He said there's no easy solution. Do we occupy Gaza? How do we do that? How do we govern it if we occupy it? He believes that Hamas's aspirations are far greater than Gaza. They want to claim leadership over the Palestinians, undisputed leadership, and marginalize the Palestinian Authority even further. And they want to undermine confidence of Israel in their own government and their own military. And they've probably done both of those. He said, as a military leader, Hamas put together an immaculate operation. He said, not immaculate morally, but it was amazing. The big question, which we're still hearing on the news, and we won't know until the investigations happen, why did the intelligence fail so badly? Why did the IDF fail so badly? He says, first of all, Hamas conducted an immaculate operation. The secrecy was incredible. Secondly, Israel relied too much on technology. That's an interesting thing. They kind of let their guard down and relax. And so once the technology was breached in some way, it, you know, fell. Thirdly, Israeli hubris, he said, this is a Jew, Israeli hubris didn't take them seriously. He said Israel may have not known specifically that this would happen, but they should have known the current policy toward Gaza is unsustainable. They weren't focused on security. There'd been a little rumblings on the West Bank, and so they were paying a little attention to that. Their political situation is in turmoil. You know, I mean, the government of Israel is in a mess over this judicial reform thing. Netanyahu has lost a lot of his support. They were distracted. So that's the big picture answer. Now, specifically what happened, I'm no military leader, but we'll find out, I expect, eventually, specifically where the failures took place. But it was a colossal failure of intelligence, which is something Israel has always prided itself on. They're just the top of the line. So they screwed up. He said, what is the Israelis' response? They're calling it the sword of iron. Decimate Hamas? A ground incursion will result in many Israeli losses. He said, can we stand that? Israeli losses, not only slaughtering of perhaps of innocent Palestinians, but they're going to lose a lot of Israeli soldiers. They've already lost thousands of people. Who will govern Gaza? Currently, they're driven by revenge, never a good military strategy, he said. They need to take a deep breath, makes good decisions. If you get bogged, he said, if you get bogged down in Gaza, then you're vulnerable in the West Bank, you're vulnerable in the north for Hezbollah. So if you get too many of your troops bogged down there, you're going to be in big trouble. Then what are we going to do? We're going to come in with our carriers and end up with a conflagration in the Middle East, which we've feared for 50 years. Hopefully not. So they say we need to strengthen the Palestinian Authority, in other words, the moderate voices within the Palestinian community. He said Arabs around the world, he said, and Palestinians have reached out to us and said, this is not us. We're with you. Hamas is not us. They've heard it from Palestinians and Arabs from the surrounding countries, Jordan, some in Egypt. How to help, he said, you can join the worldwide campaign to free the hostages or exchange the hostages somehow to get rid of these innocent people's trauma. But those are generalities, and I don't think we'll know. We are in an untenable situation in many ways.
How close are we to Iran stepping in?
That's another thing. Iran is right there. No one knows how overtly they were involved in this particular attack, but they've been supplying arms and training to Hamas. Iran may have been the ones that trained them to be able to do this kind of immaculate military operation. They probably didn't have that kind of discipline as a terrorist cell, but when you're a government and you're getting trained by Iranian militants, then you may well have that kind of expertise, both technologically and other ways. Yeah, I think Iran's right on the cusp. It is very, very volatile.
Yeah, it's a huge worry.
So horrifying to me, thinking about the future. We have an insoluble problem. And you look at the future, a friend of mine was saying, well, we could take out Iran and bomb the nuclear facilities, and they have stuff underground, so you use the nuclear weapons, arrows underground. But then what?
Right.
You could have been on Afghanistan, I don't think we're gonna have what we want.
Exactly. That's what we don't seem to be able to do, is to look to the end game, to look beyond the immediate response.
But, I feel helpless, and what are we supposed to do here to try to help? I agree with strengthening Palestinian.
Yeah, I think trying to push for some kind of balanced understanding of the situation, not cater to this sort of violent revenge mentality and frenzy that wipe them all out and that's going to fix everything. I just think we've got to be voices of moderation and reason and pray with the Palestinian Christians. That little, I like to use the word cell, that little group of Christian presence in there is 11 in the lump. It really is, and we need to support them. Our church is supporting them.
That's what I wanted to ask about what the Anglicans are doing.
Yeah.
It's not even though the Palestinian Christians, it's the Palestinian people.
That's right.
It's no different than we all don't like everything that our government
Right.
says and represents about us. Is we need to be sure that people understand that the Palestinians are not all Hamas.
Right.
Right.
Whether they're Muslims or secular or
Exactly.
Christians.
Muslims are not, there are millions of very reasonable, wonderful Muslims,
Absolutely.
and we need to not vilify them.
Yeah, that's right.
Exactly.
But
Absolutely.
Families and.
Yeah, so I think it's important in our daily conversations is not just to pound the Israeli, hard line, it's Israel number one, is to create this understanding that there is another side to this, and there are good people who have been very oppressed and don't have opportunities, and not to vilify them.
But to focus on the Christian presence just because that's a connection that we have, it's very difficult to know how to support a kind of Palestinian populace, but we do have Christian connections. We have Episcopalians, we have Anglicans who are present in Jerusalem right now. Archbishop Hassan Noam is, when I was there, was the young dean of the cathedral, St. George's Cathedral, where I did the study. He was he was a comer even in those days. He was so bright. Now he's 50 years old, and he's the Archbishop of the Holy Land, basically an Anglican Archbishop of the Holy Land. He meets with 13 other heads of churches in Jerusalem, Orthodox, Roman Catholic. They've put out several statements of moderation, several statements of listen to both narratives, support peace, support a two-state solution. They decry any kind of violence, whether it's the initial attack or overkill on the Israeli side. They're trying to balance that off. We have institutions there. This Arab Alley Hospital that I talked about, I just sent a donation to them because they care for everybody. It doesn't matter who shows up on their doorstep. It's small operation. But I think when we can find links and connections like that to support by prayer and by contributions of some kind, that's a help. Osam said on the thing the other day that he thinks the Arab Alley Hospital maybe has a month till it has to close its doors because they'll be out of medicine, out of any kind of supplies, and it's all blocked and nothing can get in. But they're going to hang in there till a month. There's a lay woman, whose name, unfortunately, I can't even pronounce, and it escapes me. She's a Palestinian Christian who runs that hospital. I don't think I've ever met a more impressive human being. She has been there through thick and thin, has always said our doors are open to everyone. She loves, the people of her region, and she's trying to do what she can. But eventually they'll be either bombed out, pray God that doesn't happen, or they'll just have to close their doors because they'll be strangled. So we do have a presence there. The Orthodox churches are strong. They're difficult because they don't get along with each other either very well, either in the Holy Land or globally. The Orthodox churches are Greek and Russian and Ukrainian, and they have all issues. They fight over the holy sites. It's amazing. I was in the Holy Sepulchre one time, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and the Franciscans were screaming at the Orthodox about who had the right to go first in the procession. So are you a voice for peace when you can't even get along within your own community? But there is an overall unity there. They certainly do meet together regularly. They do produce statements and pray for each other, and they know that they are among the last Christians standing on the ground there unless something changes.
Just a couple of things
I'm done.
On that. I printed off, Osam Noam issued a letter, I guess, yesterday. So to his folk, and so there are copies here if you want to see what he had sent out.
It's a great letter.
The other,
Is that who you're talking about?
pardon? The Archbishop, yeah. The other thing is that he mentioned to his audience yesterday, which was folks at Virginia Seminary. That's where he's a graduate from, the Archbishop of Jerusalem, and all of that is a graduate of Virginia Theological Seminary, said that he is encouraging or asking his diocese to fast and pray Tuesday, day after tomorrow. So, and he said, however you want to do it, whether it's a Lenten fast or however you want to do it, if you want to join us in that, please do whatever length of time. What did he say, dawn to dusk?
He said his personal fasting practice is dawn to dusk, no food, no water. That's basically the Muslim fast during Ramadan. But he said, whatever you do, give up something for Lent, you give up something for a particular period of time, fast for part of the day, whatever you can do, but just giving up something to remind yourself of the urgency of this. Maybe if you don't eat one meal at least, you'll have a little pain in your stomach, which might remind you that many people in the world have pain all the time. And then pray. The most important thing is to stand with them in their own prayer. And he's a deeply spiritual guy. I mean, most of his conversation had to do with that. And it wasn't a pie in the sky thing. He just believes that God's Holy Spirit is still with us and that we need to rely on it.
Yeah. And then I think, is it the American Friends of the Diocese of Jerusalem? Yep. AFDJ is, if we can take this, I'm looking at Kip because he's on outreach. We can take this to outreach. Is this something that we might want to send a donation to? Because these are folks that work with the hospital, work with other with those kinds of things. But
Schools, hospitals, social service agencies, the American Friends of the Diocese of Jerusalem is what it's called.
yeah, so those two things.
And I think we need to take care of our Jewish and Muslim friends here.
You bet.
I have a little guy who's 8, I think. He's a Palestinian Muslim. His grandfather's in prison for 20 years for, according to him, throwing stones at Jews. I don't know. But, Jews aren't his favorite people. Although he does say, I'm a Jewish person at school, and we don't like each other, but we get along. So good for you. But, I was a little afraid when he showed up after this, thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to tone down this Jew hate, like I did when he came back from the summer there. And he said, Mom, I didn't know about this. I thought it was just one of those things and it would go away after a day, and I realized it's not. And my mom said, the Hamas are wrong. That's not who we are.
Right.
And this is a family that has a lot of good reason to hate the Jews.
Yeah.
And thank God this mom has taken that tact. But I read just yesterday about a family in California somewhere, a Muslim family, the windows were shot out. It's here too. And there's a lot of that anti everything rising up again. So we need to watch out for our Jewish and Muslim friends and neighbors as well.
Jewish community and the Muslim community are really scared now. They're really on tenterhooks because of the potential violence. After 9/11, there was some against Muslims. I was still at 815, and we were trying to mitigate that whatever we could to get the word out. And remember, George W. Bush said, that this is not all Muslims, and even though I might agree or disagree with our overall response, there was some sense to try to mediate it even then, and it's doubly important now. And the Jewish community is very afraid. The rise of anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish, has been on the rise anyway, and this is only going to increase it, especially if there's any kind of criticism of Israel at all,
Going to have to stop. Thank you all. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thanks for coming. Fast and pray.
Yes, and thanks to those of you who are joining us online for coming in as well.
Yep.
See y'all soon.
Time for church. No, this is church. Really glad that obviously people are, and maybe some people get the recording.